on the Armorican League, or as Julius Caesar termed it, the Veneti Navy. Farley Mowat in the Farfarers on the subject of Armorica in chapter 6, page 57, wrote the following: "The Armoricans of classical times were prosperous traders and skilled navigators whose shipping dominated the Bay of Biscay, the English Channel, and portions of the North Sea. They carried cargo between the Mediterranean and northwestern Europe in big seaworthy ships. These vessels, combined with virtually impregnable island fortresses, made the Armorican almost invincible. Almost. They had been successfully repelling the other Gallic nations for generations, if not centuries, when in 57 BC Julius Caesar arrived on the scene, intent on conquering Western Europe and Gaul in particular." One of the main objections to the possibilities of a contact of the Old World Celts with the New World peoples is that the Celts were not a seafaring people and that they did not possess the navigational skills to attack the open seas directly. This, of course, is a half-truth and is contradicted by many good classical sources other than Appian. Indeed, throughout antiquity, maritime Celts such as the Veneti did maintain many commercial seaports dotted along the shores of the North Atlantic. And these Greek and Roman sources knew from their Celtic neighbors much about the geography of the Atlantic coast. Think of Pythias of Marseille, and of the existence of a continent on the other side of the ocean, as mentioned by Herodotus. The Greek historian Appian of Alexandria was born around 95 CE, died around 165 CE. In his History of Rome and the Spanish Wars, states that the Pyrenees extended from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Northern Ocean, that the eastern part is inhabited by Celts, otherwise known as Galatians, and more lately Gauls, and from this part westward, beginning at the Tyrrhenian Sea and making a circuit by way of the Pillars of Hercules to the Northern Ocean, the Iberians and the Celtiberians dwell. Thus the whole of Iberia is a sea-girt except the part embraced by the Pyrenees, the largest and perhaps the most precipitous mountains in Europe. In coasting, they follow the Tyrrhenian Sea as far as the Pillars of Hercules. They do not traverse the Western and Northern Ocean except in crossing over to Britain, and this they accomplish by availing themselves of the tide, as it is only half a day's journey. For the rest, neither the Romans nor any of the subject peoples navigate that ocean. And Herodotus in History Book 2, written around 440 BCE, also clearly places the Celts in the maritime regions of Western Europe. However, Julius Caesar himself maintains in his Gaelic War Commentaries, Book 3, that the Celts did have these sailing capabilities. The Armorican Venetic state controlled much of the traffic between the continent and the British Islands, and this is what he wrote. "The influence of the state is by far the most considerable of any of the countries on the whole sea coast, because the Veneti both have a very great number of ships, which they have been accustomed to sail to Britain, and thus excel the rest in their knowledge and experience of nautical affairs, and as only a few ports lie scattered along the stormy and open sea, of which they are in possession, they hold as tributaries almost all those who are accustomed to traffic in that sea. And they trusted that our army would not be able to stay very long among them on account of the insufficiency of corn. And again, even if all these things should turn out contrary to their expectation, they were very powerful in their navy. They well understood that the Romans neither had any number of ships nor were acquainted with the shallows, the harbors, or the islands of those parts where they would have had to carry on the war. And the navigation was very different in a narrow sea from what it was in the vast and open ocean. The sites of their towns were generally such that, being placed on extreme points of land and on promontories, they neither had an approach by land when the tide was rushed in from the main ocean, which always happens twice in the space of 12 hours, nor by ships, because upon the tide ebbing again, the ships were likely to be dashed upon the shoals. Thus by either circumstance was the storming of their towns rendered difficult, and if at any time perchance the Veneti, overpowered by our greatness of our works, the sea having been excluded by amount of enlarged dams, and the later being made almost equal in height to the walls of their town, had begun to despair of their fortunes, bringing up a large number of ships, of which they had a great quantity, they carried off all of their property and betook themselves to the nearest towns. There they again defended themselves by the same advantages of situation. They did this the more easily during a great part of the summer, because our ships were kept back by storms, and the difficulty of sailing was very great in that vast and open sea, with its strong tides and its harbors far apart and exceedingly few in number. For their ships were built and equipped after this manner. The keels were somewhat flatter than those of our ships, whereby they could easily encounter the shallows and the ebbing of the tide. The prows were raised very high, and in like manner the stems were adapted to the force of the waves and storms which they were formed to sustain. The ships were built wholly of oak and designed to endure any force and violence whatever. The benches, which were made of planks a foot in breadth, were fastened by iron spikes of the thickness of a man's thumb. The anchors were secured by iron chains instead of cables, and for sails they used skins and thin-dressed leather. These were, either through their want of canvas and their ignorance of its application, or for this reason, which is more probable, that they thought that such storms of the ocean and such violent gales of wind could not be resisted by sails, nor ships of such great burden be conveniently enough managed by them. The encounter of our fleet with these ships was of such a nature that our fleet exceeded in speed alone, and the plying of the oars other things, considering the nature of the place and the violence of the storms, were more suitable and better adapted on their side, for neither could our ships endure theirs with their breaks, so great was their strength, nor on account of their height was a weapon easily cast up onto them, and for the same reason they were less readily locked in by rocks. For this was added, whenever a storm began to rage and they ran before the wind, they could weather the storm more easily and heave to securely in the shallows, and when left by the tide, feared nothing from the rocks and sheaves, the risk of all of which was much to be dreaded by our own ships. So the description made here by Julius Caesar of the Veneti ships and makes it clear that these vessels were built to withstand the harsh environment of the North Atlantic, and that they could easily cross the open ocean. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, was presumably a medium-sized carrack of about 60 feet. that is 18.3 meters in length on deck, and not much larger than the smaller Pinta and Nina. The Nina and Pinta were medium-sized caravels of about 50 feet, that is 15.24 meters in length on deck. And in comparison, the American ships measured 131.2 feet, that is 41 meters in length, and over 3.4 feet, that is 12 meters in width, and 9.8 feet, that is 3 meters in drop. Its flat hulls preventing risk of prolonged immobilization after stranding during neap tide, or willing or not during spring tide. The bulwarks were also impressive, and so much more at the extremities, as they measured 16.4 to 19.7 feet, that is 5 to 6 meters above the waterline. So the Celtic or Gallic name for this category of ships was called a ponto. Now that we know that the Celts did have this ability to venture on the open seas, what did they know of the geography of the North Atlantic Ocean? In Irish lore, the Imrama were a class of popular tales describing sea journeys to faraway places, islands of the sea, and lands beyond the sea, prosaically called the Tir Manol, land of the youth, Magmel, plain of joy, Tir Fotwin, land under the wave, Tir Namdam, land of women, and all of these adventures would be reached by traveling in all directions from the west coast of Ireland. Following the mist in terrible gales and tempests, ships were blown off course and left adrift to many other fantastic islands, and not unless they were waiting till the mist subsided, they would not be in sight of a coast or a friendly shore. And not unlike Ulysses, they were lost at sea for many years before returning home from reaching these desolate places. So the heroes of the Imrama include Maldwyn, Bran MacFibel of the Voyage of Bran, and in later Christian accounts, Saint Brandon, also spelled Brandan. Although heavily Christianized, these stories of Saint Brendan are deeply rooted in old lore, and not just myth, but fairly good accounts of what these places were really like. In antiquity, the Greeks were not the only ones to know the whereabouts of the Hesperides, for it was a common mythological theme of the many Celtic peoples, testifying to the existence of these paradisical islands. And this can be explained by the intense maritime traffic needed to move cargo, livestock, and passengers to and fro from the European coast onto the British Islands. Henceforth, the notion of distant islands in the Atlantic was a vibrant common theme in Celtic lore, either in Ireland, Wales, or Brittany, as it was elsewhere off the coast of Iberia. It will not come as a surprise if someday archaeologists discover epigraphical material from Spain and Portugal on the geography of the Atlantic Ocean. Assuredly, not unlike Homer's Odyssey, the old theme of islands from beyond the ninth wave was a prevalent plot in Western European storytelling. Indeed, in History of Nature, Book 2, on page 110, Pliny does retell such a story of a British shipwreck on the Frisian coast. Tacitus Agricola chapter 25 mentions of an instance of shipwrecked persons having been treated as pirates and sold into slavery. He is speaking of a cohort of Uzipians serving in Britain who, having left the island in 3 light galleys, became the sport of winds and waves. In distress, they sailed around the extremity of the island, and through want of skill in navigation were wrecked on the continent, where they were treated as pirates, firstly by the Suevians and afterward by the Frisians. Being sold into slavery, of them reached the Roman settlements on the banks of the Rhine, and they grew famous for their sufferings, and chants were driven by tempestuous weather and cast upon Germany. And not surprisingly, when studying the Iberian epigraphy of the Canary Islands, we get the feel of an archaic form of Goidelic akin to the most ancient records found in Ogham stones in Ireland. Goidelic was also present on the continent in the Lusitanian regions of the southwestern Iberian Peninsula. Could the Celtic-speaking Iberians have been blown off to the Azores and Canary Islands on way to Hibernian colonies? Perhaps. Indeed, it does not appear to have been an impossibility. Irish mythology and folklore make much mention of islands amid the Atlantic to the south of Ireland, and Irish medieval texts have an entire genre devoted to the theme of seafaring, as we have mentioned, called the Rama, or sea ventures. And these stories featured heroes who would land on mythical islands after having traversed a thick ocean fog, or having been blown off course in gales and sailing on away to the continent. The occasional disappearance and reappearance of islands, such as with High Brazil in Irish lore, and on the sunken city of Is in Breton folk tales, reaffirmed this legend. In former years, as the story went, Breasal was the legendary king of the world, when not more humbly king of Leinster. And one of the mythic kings called Breasal resided at Bar Bresail, Barn of Breasal, a high fort that was taken and destroyed by the High King of Ireland, Tuathal Teachmer, during the war that he led against King Eochaid of Leinster. The name Breasal also reappears in later Irish tales as the king of a mythical island in the Atlantic Ocean to the southwest, called Hebrasil or O Brasil in other versions. And again, according to the legend, the island intermediately appears and disappears every 7 years. And this is how the Portuguese colony of Brazil got its name. And accordingly, the Irish myths, in the Irish myths, there were several islands in the southwest Atlantic archipelagos that were ruled by a legendary demigod king named Mananan Maclir. And in other words, he was called the Manx, the son of Lear. And the children of Lear formed a dynasty independent of the Tuatha De Danann, who were said to come from the northeast horizon. The name Lear or Lear from the old Celtic lero meant sea flow, the tide, the ebb tide, and was the main sea god of the ancient Celts, including the Brythonic peoples. This name Lear was celebrated by William Shakespeare in the eponymous play King Lear, and according to legend, this oceanic kingdom was difficult to access since navigators had to take on the open sea frontally, and few were the maritime peoples, as we mentioned, who would attempt such a venture for lack of navigational skills and seaworthy ships. And so these islands were known to the Greeks as the Hesperides, or Islands of the Blessed. And in an orchard of the Blessed Islands of the Hesperides were the sunsets there blossomed the golden apples guarded by the 100-headed dragon Loudon, son of the Titan Typhoon and the nymph Echina. And the setting sun was poetized as a golden apple, and the kingdom of the Titan Atlas was found by the Hesperides, sometimes counted as 4 or 7, and the Welsh called them Inis Ablach, or from the old Celtic Inikia, Abalaki, islands of the apple orchard, which were known as Avalon in the Arthurian and Irish tales, or High Brazil, as we have mentioned. And to the west was the island of Emain Blach, ruled by Manalan MacLear. The island on which was an orchard was said to be off the coast of Alba. To the west was the island of Emain Blach, ruled by Manalan MacLear. The island on which was an orchard, which was said to be off the coast of Alba, to the west of Scotland. And ships were then driven south using the Portugal current, according to the Irish Imrambrain, a tale of the fabulous sea voyages of Bran, while in Emain Blach, a beautiful fairy gives him a silver apple branch, and in the voyages of Bran, another Irish tale, we are given several other names for these otherworld islands. Among others, these were included Tir na Nog, the land of youth, Tir Tengri, the land of the promise, Tir Nambeng, the land of women, Inis Subai, the Isle of Joy, Tir Fothon, the land beneath the wave, Magmel, the plain of honey, and Mag Argatnel, the plain of silver clouds. And from the poems of the royal bard Taliesin, who was active in the 6th century CE, we know that the insular Brittonic peoples counted 8 islands to the south, most likely including Madeira, along with the 7 islands of the Canary archipelago. And to it, these islands were called Caer Sidi, Caer Pedfran, Caer Vedwid, Caer Igor, Caer Widir, Caer Golud, Caer Vandui, and Caer Achren. And one only reaches these islands through the invitation of Manalan Lir from his daughters. The process of crossing into the other world was termed Echtra, or Echtrae in Gaelic Irish. Most often the voyager is unconsciously lured by a siren, the Muirgan, or a fairy, the Banshee. And there is a passage in one of the poems in the book of Taliesin, The Spoils of Annwn, which relates of King Arthur's sea ventures to capture these islands in hope of finding a sacred cauldron, the sacred cauldron of Avalon. And here with us the naming of the 7 islands mentioned by Taliesin. In his poem he says, except 7, none returned from Caer Sidi, except 7, none returned from Caer Vedwid, except 7, none returned from Caer Igor, except 7, none returned from Caer Golud, who caused that he should not go to the dales of the Defui. They know not the brindle ox, thick his headband, 70 knobs on his collar, and when they went with Arthur of anxious memory, except 7, none returned from Caer Fandui. When we went with Arthur of anxious contention, except 7, none returned from Caer Achren. So this sets the general mood for the islands known, generally known by the medieval Celts in the Atlantic, in the North Atlantic. There were other islands known, as you know, the island of Bran, which could possibly have been the Newfoundland or the coast of Acadia or maritime Canada, since there was the mention of a gulf which was called the Sea of Bran, which would have been the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And so this is just conjecture, but it is a possibility nevertheless. And so this about completes our survey of the geography, the known geography of the North Atlantic by the old Celtic mariners, and also on the subject of the Venetic Sea League, otherwise known as the Armorican Sea League, as mentioned by Farley Mowat in the Farfarers. All for now. Goodbye.